Hi, Symphony Chorus friends. This is Josh, and I am coming to you from my home office while we're here in quarantine in Dallas. And I really miss you. And I want you to know that I'm thinking of you and wish that we could be together tonight for our regular Monday night rehearsal. But things being as they are, I thought the next best thing would be just to come at you from another angle and share some great information about some choral music that we're going to be singing next year, the Verdi Requiem, which is one of the great orchestral pieces of all time, chorus and orchestra, of course, and one of my personal favorites, and one of the pieces that I really grew up singing in the San Francisco Symphony Chorus many years ago. So today is just a really informal talk. This is not going to be high production value. In fact, you're likely to hear kids in the background because my kids' school is also quarantined and closed. So we've got two kids at home, and there's likely to just be noise and coming and going, but that's how my household is right now. So bear with me as we do a little talk on Verdi Requiem. And before we do, I thought I'd share just some resources with you in case you're interested in sort of learning more. I love this book. This is David Rosen's Verdi Requiem book. It's pretty scholarly, so it's a little bit more on the heavy theoretical side. It's published by Cambridge University Press. I really like that. I love this book, which is the Michael Steinberg Choral Masterworks. This is Choral Masterworks, a listener's guide. Michael Steinberg was the program annotator in San Francisco and in other symphonies, and he writes in a really accessible style. That's probably a 200-page book, and it talks about maybe 15, 20 different pieces. So the articles aren't long. They're 8, 9 pages long. They're really readable, and if you're a fan of choral orchestral music, and I know you are, because you're a singer in the symphony chorus, then you might enjoy that book. So you can check those out. And then, of course, I'm looking at this, which is the Peters reduction, the choral reduction for Verdi. And then I like this for a full score because it's not that expensive. This is the Dover editions of the Verdi Requiem in full score. This is only $10.95 when it was published. I probably got this 15 years ago. So maybe it's $15 now. But it's still really affordable. And here you can get the full score that has everything in it, all the orchestral parts. So all those things are available for home delivery. And if you're interested in grabbing a hold of those and learning more that way, of course, you are welcome to do so. But you don't have to, because I'm going to walk you through a couple of the movements of Verdi today. And my plan is to talk specifically about the overall work, how it came to be, and then the first section, which is the Introit and the Kyrie. So let's go back to 1868, and the great Rossini died. This is the great Italian operatic composer who, by the way, also wrote some great choral music, including a good Stabat Mater and some nice a cappella pieces, and the Petite Messe Solennelle, another great Rossini piece that you might have sung. So Rossini dies in 1868, and he was a beloved figure. And so Verdi proposes a Requiem Mass in his honor to be produced by the city of Bologna, which was Rossini's hometown. This piece was going to be composed, this was Verdi's idea, by 13 different Italian composers, each of whom would take one movement. So it would be like a compilation. Verdi himself was going to write the closing movement, which is the Libera Me. So this happens, the composers are all engaged, each of them donates their time, they donate even some expenses to have the parts copied, and then financial problems and artistic jealousies torpedo the whole thing, and the project ultimately is scrapped. The city of Bologna backs out, doesn't provide the orchestra and the chorus, and the Messa per Rossini, which is what it was going to be called, the Mass for Rossini, is never performed. The score is taken back by Ricordi. Ricordi is Verdi's publisher, and so they take the manuscript back, and it's put in a vault and essentially forgotten. Verdi was really disappointed by this, but he turns to other projects. At this time, he starts working on Aida, which he's writing for the new opera house in Cairo, Egypt. And so he gets back to work on that and just forgets about the Mass for Rossini altogether. Then, some years later, in 1873, the great Italian poet and writer Alessandro Manzoni dies. Together with Rossini, Manzoni was the other Italian who was beloved, a beloved artistic figure who united all of the Italian-speaking people. You have to remember now, Italy was not yet a country. It was a combination of various Italian states on the peninsula, some of which were self-governing, others were governed by the Vatican, the Papal States, others were governed by Austria and by France. So there was no Italy at this time. but there were certain figures that united all Italians, and Rossini was one, Manzoni is the other, and Verdi idolized him. He was especially important because Manzoni, advocated for what's called the Risorgimento, which means the reunification, the political unification of Italy. And Verdi himself was also a fan of this movement. Both of them served in the Senate in order to get this through. So they were both artists and also political figures. So the two, Manzoni and Verdi, were revered for their advocacy on behalf of Italians who were longing to be free of the Austrians and of the French. And Verdi's own name actually became a rallying cry for those that believed in Italian independence. If you take it as I think it's called an acrostic, so each of his letters itself forms a word, V-E-R-D-I, Verdi, V-E-R-D-I, can be expanded to V, Viva, E, Emanuele, Emmanuel, R, Re, which means king, Di, d'Italia. Viva Emanuele, Re d'Italia, long live Emmanuel, King of Italy, who was the king of this proposed and eventually accomplished unified Italian state. So, Verdi and Manzoni are two major Italian figures. Manzoni dies, and Verdi comes back to the idea of a requiem. And he says, we're going to reuse this music that I wrote for Rossini that never was used. That will be my starting place for the Libera Me, and then I will write the rest of the Requiem myself. He proposes this to the city of Milan this time, and Milan wants to succeed where Bologna has failed, and so they accept the project, and he gets to work. In 1873, he writes to Ricordi, and he says, send me my manuscript back of this music. And by 1874, March, he completes the Requiem Aeternam and the Dies Irae. A couple weeks later, April 9, he finishes the Sanctus, Agnus Dei, and the Lux Aeterna, and a revised version of the Libera Me, which he wrote for Messa per Rossini. And then just a week later, April 15th, he completes the last movement, the Offertorium. That's not the last movement in the composition, the way it's performed, but it was the last one that Verdi wrote, because the Libera Me he had written previously. So he finishes the Offertorium, and the whole thing is done. April 15th, 1874. Verdi himself conducts the first performance, which is just about 5 weeks later, May 22nd, 1874, at St. Mark's in Milan. The first performance takes place in the context of a church service, but with its theatrical drama, this work finds its most natural expression as a concert piece, which is how it's been known ever since. That theatrical quality, interestingly, was attacked by some, especially the very famous German critic Hans von Bülow, who, having seen the score, Bülow was in Milan when it was to be premiered. He didn't go to the performance, but he got a look at the score, and he said, it is insufficiently serious, and this is quoting him now, it is, quote, an opera in ecclesiastical clothing, unquote. Well, Brahms hears this after hearing the music, and he writes to his friend von Bülow because they knew each other, and he told him that he, von Bülow, had, quote, made an ass of himself. That was Brahms' opinion. Eventually, von Bülow does recant, but it took him 18 years. 18 years later, after having heard the work, von Bülow writes to Verdi, and he writes a very apologetic letter, and he says, I'm very, very sorry. But at the time, Verdi was attacked by some. So it's interesting to know that this piece that is now universally loved was not always universally loved when it was first composed. I want to talk a little bit about the Requiem Mass and what a Requiem Mass is. So Requiem Mass is a special Mass that's said in the Catholic Church, typically on All Souls Day, which is November the 2nd. It's also given for burial ceremonies or commemoration or anniversaries of burial ceremonies. Its name comes from the first line of text in the text that's said, which is Requiem Aeternam, eternal rest. It differs significantly from the traditional Mass, most notably in that the Gloria and the Credo of the traditional Mass are omitted, and they're replaced by the Dies Irae, which is a powerful depiction of the Day of Judgment. Musically, requiems were chanted, so single-line monophonic chant, until the first polyphonic settings, polyphonic meaning multiple voices intertwining with each other. Those first polyphonic settings happened in around the 15th century. The oldest one that we have that's surviving today is by the Flemish composer Ockeghem. We think that there were some earlier settings, but the scores didn't survive. So Akagem is the only one that we have. And then he was followed by many, many more composers who set this Requiem text. Some of my favorites are the great Renaissance Spanish composers, Morales, Guerrero, Victoria. They all wrote theirs in the 16th century or very, very early 17th century in the case of Victoria, 1603. In the Baroque period, Requiem settings begin to wane a little bit. So the Baroque being more or less 1600 to 1750, we see fewer of them because the cantata is more popular. We're moving more to a focus in Germanic lands and Lutheran religious practice, which doesn't have the same focus on the Requiem Mass as the Catholic lands do. So in the Baroque period, we have fewer, although there are still a few. But then in the classical period, there's a shift back to focus in Austria, which is a Catholic country, and a resurgence of requiems, including Mozart's great unfinished Requiem that we all know and love. In addition, there are other classical era requiems that are terrific. Two excellent settings by Luigi Cherubini, one's for men's chorus, the other one for mixed chorus. And then, of course, the drama of the Requiem Mass was a perfect fit for the Romantic period, the 1820, 1830 or so, all the way through the end of the 19th century, when this Romantic period takes root and drama is highly prized in music. And of course, there is no greater dramatic text than the Dies Irae as part of the Requiem Mass. And so there is a flourishing of Requiem Mass settings in the 19th century. And we have settings by Berlioz, by Liszt, by Bruckner, by Dvorak, and of course by Verdi. Brahms also selected his own text, so instead of taking the traditional Latin text, Brahms created his own German Requiem, which was his own text choices in German. Interestingly, not a German translation of the traditional Latin, but his own texts from the Bible. And then, of course, in the 20th century, great composers like Benjamin Britten followed Brahms' model, and they inserted new texts, in this case, poetry by Wilfred Owen from World War I, into the traditional Latin text, combining them in one of the great 20th century orchestral works, the Britten War Requiem, which the DSO performed in 2013 and 14. And that's one of the great choral orchestral works in the repertoire. So let's talk a little bit about the individual movements that we're going to mention today, just really the first section. Like Mozart, Verdi sets the Introit and the Kyrie, which are the two opening sections, as two distinct but connected movements. These are the texts. I'll read them first in Latin and then in English. Requiem aeternam dona eis Domine, et lux perpetua luceat eis. Grant them eternal rest, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. Te decet hymnus Deus in Sion, et tibi redetur votum in Jerusalem. Exaudi orationem meam ad te omnis caro veniet. A hymn is fitting for thee in Zion, O Lord, and a vow shall be returned to thee in Jerusalem. Hear my prayer, to thee all flesh shall come. And then a repeat of the opening. Requiem aeternam dona eis Domine, et lux perpetua luceat eis. So Verdi approaches this text and follows the natural format of the text, which is A-B-A. Two sections, the A sections that are like, with a B section in the middle that is contrasting, and that's the Te decet hymnus, the contrasting middle section. To get into some of the musical ideas, I'm going to take you from my office down to my piano and continue with a couple musical examples. So here we are down at the piano, and we're going to explore a couple of these musical ideas and how Verdi puts them together. So at the opening, muted cellos, the cellos playing con sordino with the mute, play a descending theme that spans an octave. It sounds like this. This is then taken up by the first violins, also muted, and establishes a really solemn mood, and the chorus sings in open fifths, which gives us an archaic feeling, something that's referencing older music than Verdi's time. The whole thing from the violin entry. That last figure, Requiem aeternam in bar 10, is listed here in the score as soft as possible. And that kind of marking is really typical of this piece. Verdi is always working in extremes. You'll see up to triple forte marked in the score, so fortissimo and then fortissimo, and then amazingly you see all the way up to 5 pianos marked. So Verdi is really working in extremes, and it's drama that he's after. Next comes a beautiful moment in the sopranos that is built on a chain of suspensions. These are suspensions in the voices and in the violins. I'm going to play it, and then I'm going to talk about what a suspension is. So here's the section beginning in bar 11, 12. Now, suspensions. These are notes that are outside the bass harmony so that are in tension with the existing harmony. So usually the way they work is you have a note, then you introduce a changing bass note that makes the original note dissonant against it and creates a tension which is then released. So if I just focus on that soprano melody for a moment, you'll hear the suspensions against the bass. 1. There. 1. Here again. You hear that? There's your dissonance, and that's a suspension. And then it repeats again. Now, what's amazing about this and what Verdi does is he's not only suspending the voice part, but also the first violin part. Listen to this, just the first violin against the bass. Do you hear this? There's your suspension again. Again. And so what we have here is essentially a chain of double suspensions, one in the violin, one in the voice, all against the bass, and the whole thing sounds like this. It's incredibly simple, tuneful music, but it has so much pathos and feeling in it because of those double suspensions. Then, bar 17, we have a stunning shift to the parallel major key. So we've been in A minor the whole time. And then all of a sudden, we move to the parallel major, which is really a surprise, because very often in the style, you would move more traditionally to a relative minor. If you're in A minor, you might move through here to C major, because A minor and C major share the same key signature, no sharps, no flats. But here it's completely different, and more traditional of later music, especially 19th century music, to move to a parallel major key, which means it's the same note name, in this case A minor moving to A major. And that is an extraordinary musical moment in this piece, especially because it's set up in the bass, particularly in the cellian basses, by an ascending line that covers, once again, an octave. Just like we had here at the beginning, from E to E. Now we're going to have an octave. There's actually an E here, so it makes, once again, an octave. And then a shift. What's especially beautiful about this is not only is he inverting that original descending line, but he's adding an additional second on top of it. We would expect an octave. We would expect an octave going up. But what we actually get is one step higher. It's a beautiful moment. Some writers have called this a ray of sunshine entering into a sunlit, a now sunlit room, entering into a dark room. This leads eventually to a very interesting and deceptive cadence. So we're going along. Luce ad eis sounds like this. Where are we? Yes. And we would expect, or maybe, but what we get is a deceptive cadence, a surprising cadence, F major. And this is going to be important for later, so remember that, A into F. And now we get the central contrasting section. And here the text talks about a hymn and a promise. A promise is due to ye, or promise to thee, O God, in Zion. And Verdi's responding to those words of promise and vow and hymn by creating a hymn-like, sort of sturdy theme that could be taken up now in a stile antico reference. Stile antico, an Italian term referring to old style, music before Bach. So this is 16th century style counterpoint, something that maybe Palestrina would have written. Each voice taking it up at the fifth, or at the octave. Basses first, and then tenors, and then altos, and then soprano the same. This is a very old style, traditional reference to old church music that Verdi is making, and really distinguishing it from his operatic writing. As much as the Germans might have criticized him for being too operatic, this is a moment that is really straight out of music history, especially the history of sacred music. So we come to the end of that. We cadence in F major, and then back to the original material, which is almost exactly a repetition. There are a few very small differences, but for the most part, the music is the same as it was before, until we come to the final cadence. And now, and suddenly here's our A major again. So we were expecting A minor, we got A major, and it is time for the soloists to make their appearance, possibly in a little bit of operatic competition with each other. The tenor is first, and his melody, or some version of it, will be taken up by all of the soloists in turn. This is his tune. And everyone has it. The bass then has. Sorry. And the soprano and the mezzo, each one gets their turn at it. What's interesting is this tune reaches up to the leading tone. If we're in A major now, that's our home key. Reaching, but never quite makes it up to the home key. And so we have that sense of a prayer being lifted up, being offered by earthbound humans, but realizing that it can never reach all the way up until the end of the movement, and stay tuned on that. You notice how the tune is also accompanied by a counter melody. There's a counter melody in the bassoons and in the cello, and it sounds like this. And then the same thing in a new key. Now, do you recognize that? Do you remember this? A descending line by octave in the cello, right? Spanning exactly an octave and coming down. Well, here we have the same idea, but it's in major now, and we've got a few chromatic notes thrown in for fun. That's our octave, and it's the same octave from E to E. And then he gives you a little bit more, and then repeats it. And then we have it moving through all the keys. And this is really what is amazing about Verdi's Requiem, is that the tunes themselves are incredibly melodic, they're appealing, they're natural, but there's also a unity, a musical unity throughout the whole work, where we see him playing with motives and transforming them and flipping them around to keep a cohesive whole so that the piece really hangs together so well. So in this middle section, it's all contrasting, and we move through a lot of different keys very quickly. Each of the soloists has his or her turn. The chorus punctuates each of the sections. At the big cadence, the chorus always enters until that, the final instability. We actually get pretty far away. We get into various keys until we finally get back to A major. And that happens bar 130. So we come all the way back, and we're almost at the end. And then there's this incredible moment that Verdi uses to finish out the piece. He finishes here. F major out of nowhere. And of course the chorus on top. Pianissimo together with soloists. Now, do you remember where that came from? Do you remember? That same harmonic relationship of moving from what we expected to be A major, and now all of a sudden F, it's come back again. So you see that unity. Verdi really brings these things together, and we're not conscious of them necessarily when we hear them, but when we go in and study the score, we realize what he's doing is creating this puzzle and this incredible musical tapestry out of just a few very simple ideas. So we have that, and this is one of the great harmony sort of transitions, harmonic progressions of the 19th century. Here it is. And now, that's just a plain old 5-1, but we're in A major and we're on B flat, which is very rare. This is a very foreign key. We're on B flat, very foreign chord to A major. And then the side slip again. To get us back to A major. It's almost like barbershop. We have F, and then we're back home in A. And as a last little thing, he brings us walking up to heaven. First the cello and the violas, and then first and second violins. And that's Verdi's Introit and Kyrie. But we know there's more to come, and we're not going to stay in heaven forever because Dies Irae is next. So stay tuned next week for another installment of trips through Verdi's Requiem. And until then, go out and search for some great recordings that you might enjoy. Personally, the one that I grew up on is Riccardo Muti and the Chicago Symphony Orchestra with Pavarotti singing the tenor. I know it's on YouTube, so you can check that out. There are also recordings of Fabio Luisi out there performing this work. I haven't found any on YouTube yet. I found the Dies Irae, but not this first movement. But see what you can find. Browse around, and I'll look forward to visiting with you again on our next installment of Choral Orchestral Talks. Until then, take care and be safe and be well.